Navy veteran Jack Reynolds stood frozen on his porch as floodwaters roared through Missoula, but he wasn't watching the storm. He was watching the past. Years ago, he had followed an order that saved many and destroyed one life he could never forget. Since then, water had always sounded like judgment. Then something flashed in the current, a rotting plank spinning fast. On it, a gray and black German Shepherd mother ribs showing paws slipping as she fought to stay upright. Pressed against her chest was one tiny puppy trembling like a single fragile heartbeat. For anyone else, it was heartbreaking. For Jack, it was the same nightmare returning. The plank was being pulled toward the fastest bend of the river. The mother dog lifted her head and released a low, broken sound, less a bark than a prayer. Jack had only seconds to decide: step forward and face the storm, or stay still and drown in his past. If you believe miracles can still happen in the middle of a storm, type AIM in the comments. Please subscribe because the choice he makes next will change everything. Rain did not fall over Missoula, Montana. It pressed down heavy and relentless, turning the river into a living thing that breathed and moved with intent. Jack Reynolds stood at the edge of his porch as the Clark Fork swelled beyond its banks, the water climbing and reshaping the land with quiet violence. He was 38, tall and lean in the way men become when muscle is built for endurance rather than display. His shoulders were broad but carried a slight forward tilt, as if years under a rucksack had trained him to expect weight. A rough brown beard shadowed a jaw cut sharp by discipline, not vanity, and his hair, once regulation short, had grown uneven, streaked with early gray at the temples. His eyes were a pale, watchful blue, the kind that scanned horizons even when nothing was supposed to be there. People in town knew him as a former Navy SEAL, though Jack rarely corrected them when they whispered the one who quit. He hadn't quit. He had survived something that left him quieter, harder to reach, and unwilling to promise anything to anyone, not even himself. The flood had come early this year, fed by sudden warmth and impatient snowmelt from the mountains. Jack had prepared as he always did, sandbags stacked, generator-tested ropes coiled and ready. Preparation was the one habit grief had sharpened instead of dulling. 5 years earlier, during a coastal extraction gone wrong overseas, Jack had followed orders that saved many and doomed one. The man had been younger, loud in his optimism, and Jack had been the one to call the retreat. Since then, Jack lived as if the world might demand another impossible decision at any moment. That was when he saw it: movement where movement shouldn't be. Not debris, not the familiar spin of broken branches or fence boards, but something that resisted the water's command. A warped plank of rotting wood spun sideways in the current, dipping and rising like a lung trying to breathe. Clinging to it was a German Shepherd mother, gray and black, dulled by mud, her fur plastered tight against a frame made skeletal by hunger. She was large-boned, built for strength, but starvation had carved her down to angles and will. One ear bent slightly forward, torn long ago, and her eyes, dark, intelligent, unblinking, tracked every shift of the water. Pressed against her belly was a single puppy, no more than 6 weeks old, a smaller echo of her coloring paws, slipping body, trembling with each surge. Jack felt his chest tighten. He told himself to assess, not react. That was the rule that had kept him alive. The plank drifted closer to the bend where the river accelerated, where Undertow grabbed and did not negotiate. The mother dog lowered her head over the puppy, bracing her hind legs, wide claws scraping uselessly against wet wood. She did not bark. She did not whine. Her silence was not fear, it was focus. For a moment, Jack did nothing. He felt the old paralysis creep in, the same stillness that had followed him home from war, the belief that choosing wrong was worse than not choosing at all. The river roared louder now, as if offended by his hesitation. Then the dog lifted her head and let out a short, broken sound, not a plea, but a warning, a statement of refusal. It struck Jack harder than any scream. He moved, not quickly, not recklessly, but with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned the cost of wasted motion. He strapped a safety line around his waist, tested the anchor post twice, and took the metal gaff hook from its place by the door. The water was colder than he expected, biting through denim and skin alike, but Jack welcomed the pain. Pain was present. Pain meant now. As he stepped into the flood, the dog finally growled low and thin, her body shifting to shield the puppy. Jack spoke without raising his voice, slow and even, the way he once had to wounded men who needed calm more than orders. The plank bumped against a submerged rock, spun again, and the puppy slipped. In a blur of instinct, the mother caught the pup by the scruff, hauled it back against her chest, and reset her stance. Jack reached the plank just as the current tried to tear it free. Metal met wood. The river fought. Jack leaned back, muscles burning, and pulled. When the plank scraped into shallower water, the fight broke. Jack lifted the puppy, first astonishingly light warm despite the cold, and then with a grunt that tore from somewhere older than pride, he hoisted the mother dog onto the bank. She collapsed briefly, sides heaving, then dragged herself forward to press her nose to the puppy, counting breath by breath. Jack sank to his knees beside them, soaked and shaking. The river still raged, but it had not taken everything tonight. He did not name the dog yet. He did not touch her again. He simply sat there breathing, understanding with a clarity that hurt staying had been the choice. Morning arrived, gray and uncertain, the rain easing into a thin mist that hovered over Missoula like a held breath, leaving the river swollen and restless, but no longer screaming. Jack Reynolds woke on the hard bench of his mudroom muscles, locked in the dull ache that followed exertion and cold. His clothes hung dripping near the door, and the smell of wet wood, river silt, and old oil filled the small cabin. For a moment he didn't move. Silence after danger always felt louder to him than gunfire. It gave memories room to walk. A soft sound cut through the stillness. Not a whine, not a bark, a low, warning breath. Jack turned his head slowly. The German shepherd mother stood near the far wall, positioned between him and a shallow crate he had lined with towels during the night. Her posture was rigid, but not aggressive, legs braced, spine straight, head low. In the dim light, her coat showed more clearly, a stormy blend of ash gray and black, streaked with rust where mud had dried into her fur. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 3 years old, but hardship had aged her. Her ribs were still visible despite the food he'd left untouched nearby. Her eyes followed Jack with sharp, measuring intelligence. Inside the crate, the puppy stirred. Small. Fragile. A living question mark. Its ears were still soft, half-folded, its paws oversized for its body as if it hadn't grown into the world yet. The pup made a weak complaining sound, and immediately the mother shifted, lowering her head to nudge it with her nose, counting it again, reassured by touch. Jack pushed himself upright, moving carefully, palms open and visible. He remembered villages where dogs watched strangers with the same tension, deciding whether a man was threat or weather. He spoke quietly, not to command, not to soothe, but to exist honestly in the space. The dog did not retreat, but she did not advance either. That felt like permission. By mid-morning, the road beyond Jack's property became passable. That was when the truck arrived, its tires crunching slowly over wet gravel. A woman stepped out, average height, slim but strong, her posture alert in the way of someone who learned to anticipate problems. She wore waterproof boots, splashed with mud, and a dark green jacket marked with the insignia of Missoula County Animal Services. Her hair was chestnut brown, pulled into a low braid streaked with silver, not from age but stress. Her skin was pale freckled across the nose, and her eyes, hazel steady, took in everything at once. Jack Reynolds, she called, her voice firm but not intrusive. I'm Emily Carter. Emily Carter was in her early 40s, a veterinarian by training, but the kind shaped by years in emergency shelters and disaster response. People said she had a way of speaking to frightened animals that worked because she never pretended the world was gentle. She acknowledged danger, then offered an alternative. Floods had taken her first clinic years ago, and since then she had treated every emergency like borrowed time. Jack nodded once and stepped aside. Emily's gaze fell immediately on the dog. She stopped moving, didn't approach, didn't crouch. She simply waited, respecting the line the animal had drawn. The mother shepherd stiffened lips, pulling back just enough to show teeth, not in threat but warning. Emily responded by sitting down on the cold floor, her movements unhurried, her attention angled away. She's feral, Emily said quietly, more observation than label. Not abused, not trained, just survived long enough to learn people don't always stay. Jack felt something tighten in his chest. He understood that language too well. Emily examined the puppy first from a distance, checking breathing movement signs of shock. The pup was dehydrated, underweight, but alive in the stubborn way life sometimes chose to be. When Emily reached slowly into her bag and produced a small metal bowl of water, the mother dog stepped forward, sniffed it, then drank deeply, never taking her eyes off the vet. Trust, Jack realized, didn't arrive as warmth. It arrived as calculation. The river will rise again tonight, Emily said after a while, standing. We're setting up temporary kennels on higher ground. I can take them now, or... She hesitated, glancing at Jack. Or you can keep them here another night. She won't travel easily, and she won't forgive being separated from the pup." Jack looked at the dog, then at the puppy, then at his own hands. He thought of all the nights he had spent alone, believing isolation was the safest form of control. "They can stay," he said finally. The dog did not relax, but she lay down, curling her body around the crate, anchoring herself between danger and what mattered. Jack felt the quiet weight of a choice settle into place. This wasn't rescue anymore. This was responsibility. And for the first time in years, that didn't feel like a punishment. By late afternoon, the sky darkened again, not with rain yet, but with the heavy, bruised look of a decision waiting to be made, and the river answered with a deeper, slower sound that Jack Reynolds recognized as pressure rather than noise. Jack stood outside the cabin, stacking the last of the sandbags along the lower edge of the porch. His movements were efficient, economical the way they had been drilled into him years ago, but there was a faint tremor in his forearms that had nothing to do with fatigue. The choice he had made that morning to let the dog and her pup stay had settled into him like a weight he could not shrug off. Responsibility always felt heavier after the adrenaline faded. Inside, the German Shepherd mother lay curled around her puppy, her body forming a deliberate wall. She had shifted since dawn, no longer rigid with constant threat, but she was not relaxed either. Her head lifted at every unfamiliar sound, ears angling toward the windows, toward the river, toward Jack. In clearer light, Jack could see the fine scars along her muzzle and legs, pale lines crossing darker fur, old injuries healed without care. She was not reckless. She was experienced. That realization changed how Jack moved around her. He began to move as if she were a partner instead of a problem. The puppy Ash, the name Jack had begun using quietly in his own head, had grown bolder through the day. Still unsteady, still thin, but alive with the awkward curiosity of something discovering survival for the first time. Ash pawed at Jack's boot once, then retreated instantly when the mother's head snapped up. Jack froze, then slowly backed away. He understood boundaries. Boundaries had kept men alive. The knock came just before dusk. 3 firm raps spaced evenly the knock of someone who didn't like surprises. Jack opened the door to find a man standing on the porch in a rain-darkened jacket, broad-shouldered, thick through the chest, his presence filling the narrow space. He was in his mid-40s with a square face framed by a trimmed salt-and-pepper beard and close-cropped black hair. His eyes were dark, assessing, but not unkind. A badge glinted briefly at his belt. "Evening," the man said. "I'm Deputy Mark Holloway." Mark Holloway had grown up in Missoula, the kind of local lawman who knew which roads flooded first and which families refused to evacuate no matter how often they were told. Years earlier, a flash flood had taken his younger brother while Mark was still in the academy, and since then he carried a quiet intensity, a habit of double-checking warnings no one else wanted to hear. "We're doing door-to-door checks," Holloway continued. "Rivers projected to crest higher than this morning. I saw the lights on." Jack nodded and stepped aside. Holloway's gaze immediately found the dog. His posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable weight settling back, hands relaxing near but not on his belt. The shepherd rose in response, placing herself squarely between the deputy and the crate. No sound, no snarl, just a line drawn in muscle and bone. "She's with me," Jack said evenly. Holloway studied Jack for a moment, recognition flickering. "Reynolds," he said. "You were Navy, right?" Jack didn't answer directly. He never did. Holloway nodded anyway. "Figures," he said, glancing back at the dog. "You planning to ride this one out?" "Yes." The deputy exhaled slowly. "Then you should know we've got another problem. Old trailer downriver Cedar Bend." No response from the owner. "Water's already cut the access road." The words hit Jack harder than he expected. He felt the familiar internal shift, the quiet alignment of purpose and dread. Before he could speak, the dog barked once short, sharp, then turned her head toward the river, toward the direction Holloway had mentioned. The sound raised the hair on Jack's arms. It wasn't alarm, it was recognition. Holloway's eyebrows lifted. "That's a hell of a coincidence," he muttered. Jack looked from the deputy to the dog, then back again. "I'll go," he said. Holloway shook his head. "County's sending a boat. They won't make it in time," Jack replied, his voice steady but cold with certainty. He had learned to read currents, to read minutes, the way other people read clocks. "I can." The dog paced once, then returned to the crate, nudging the puppy deeper beneath her chest. She looked at Jack again, and this time her gaze held something else. Not warning, not fear, but expectation. Holloway hesitated. He saw the risk weighted against the river, against the man in front of him, who stood like someone already committed. Finally, he nodded once. "I'll call it in," he said. "I'll cover you as far as the road goes." Jack grabbed his jacket and rope without ceremony. He knelt briefly, meeting the dog's eyes. He didn't touch her. He didn't promise. He simply stood, and she watched him go without sound. Outside, the river surged again, louder now, impatient. Jack stepped into the coming night knowing the choice he had made this morning had already begun to ask more of him. Night closed in fast, the kind that swallowed landmarks and left only sound, and the river used that darkness to change its mind again. Jack Reynolds moved along the flooded track toward Cedar Bend, with the rope slung across his chest and the beam of his headlamp cutting a narrow tunnel through rain. Deputy Mark Holloway stayed back at the last dry rise, radio pressed to his shoulder, a steady voice anchoring Jack's movements to something human. The access road was gone now, erased into a sheet of brown water flecked with foam, and the river's voice had deepened into a continuous growl that spoke of undertow and patience. Jack didn't hurry. He paced himself the way he had learned to do when speed invited mistakes. The trailer sat crooked against a stand of cottonwoods, one corner lifted, the skirting torn away. Water pressed against the door like a living thing trying to enter. Jack waded to the steps, tested the ground with his boot, then braced himself and knocked. No answer. He tried the handle. It didn't move. Inside, something struck metal. 3 dull thumps, irregular, desperate. "Hold on," Jack called, pitching his voice low and steady so it could cut through fear. He pried the door with the gaff hook and forced it open enough to squeeze inside. The smell hit first damp insulation, old oil, panic. The man inside was slumped against the kitchenette, one arm wrapped around a cabinet leg. He was in his late 60s, tall once, but now stooped with a narrow face etched by sun and stubborn years. His hair was white and thin, plastered to his scalp, and his beard had grown wild and uneven, the kind men stopped trimming when the world felt like it was ending anyway. His name, he rasped, was Thomas Green. He had lived here 30 years, outlasted storms and layoffs, and a wife who left quietly after the second winter. The pipes froze. A stroke 2 years earlier had slowed his right side, leaving him proud and careful, unwilling to evacuate because leaving meant admitting he couldn't always make it back on his own. Jack looped the rope around Thomas's torso, checking the knot twice, then guided him step by step toward the door. Outside, the river surged, lifting debris that struck the trailer with hollow thuds. Jack timed their move, waited for a lull that existed only as a rhythm, and pushed them into it. The water grabbed Thomas's legs. Jack countered by angling his body, letting the rope take the load. They made it to the cottonwoods, then to the rise where Holloway and 2 county volunteers waited, hands outstretched. When Thomas was safe, Jack felt the delayed tremor run through him, the body's receipt for what the mind had just spent. Holloway clapped his shoulder, once firm and brief. "You did good," he said, not as praise but as fact. Jack turned back toward the river, already thinking of the cabin. That was when he heard it. A sound that did not belong to water or wind. A bark short and sharp carried by the current from upstream. Then another. At the cabin, the German Shepherd mother had made a decision of her own. The water had crept under the porch, cold fingers testing thresholds. She rose, nudged the puppy Ash deeper into the crate, then hooked her teeth into the rope Jack had left coiled by the wall. It was a simple calculation. Rope meant movement. Movement meant survival. She dragged the coil to the door, shoved it open with her shoulder, and paused, just long enough to look back at Ash. The puppy squeaked once, confused. The mother licked his head once, then turned and plunged into the flood. She swam with economy body, low head steady, pulling the rope behind her like a promise. Downriver, Jack heard the bark again and changed direction without thinking. He followed sound the way sailors followed stars. The beam of his headlamp caught gray fur cutting across the current, the rope trailing, then snagging briefly on a submerged post before coming free. Easy, Jack breathed, wading in. The dog reached him, eyes locked on his jaws, still clamped on the rope. She didn't surrender it, she offered it. Jack took the line, felt the tension that spoke of a second problem upstream. Together they worked back toward the cabin, Jack using the rope to keep them angled against the push. Inside, Ash cried a thin, insistent sound that cut through the roar. The mother surged ahead, shaking water from her coat as she crossed the threshold, then went straight to the crate, pressing her body around the puppy as if to count the edges of him again. Jack closed the door and wedged it chest, heaving, heart pounding with something like awe. The river rose another inch and stopped as if offended by refusal. Jack sat on the floor back to the wall and let the moment land. The dog did not approach him. She lay with her chin on the crate's edge, eyes open, watching the door. Trust, he realized, had widened by a fraction, enough to hold. Outside, Holloway's radio crackled with updates, the storm's tempo easing. Inside, 3 lives breathed in uneven rhythm held by rope and choice. Jack understood then that survival wasn't a single act. It was a chain. And tonight, none of them had let go. Morning returned gently this time, not as forgiveness, but as permission, the river slipping back into its banks as if embarrassed by what it had tried to take. Sunlight filtered through thinning clouds and touched the cabin walls, revealing mud lines like scars that had already begun to fade. Jack Reynolds stood barefoot on the porch, a mug of burnt coffee cooling in his hands, watching steam rise from the soaked earth. His body ached in the honest way that followed survival, but beneath the soreness there was something unfamiliar and light. The storm was over, and for once it had not demanded a final payment. Inside, the German Shepherd mother lay stretched on her side, finally allowing rest to claim her. In daylight, she looked less like a shadow and more like what she truly was, a powerful working dog shaped by hardship rather than ownership. Her coat, once dulled by mud, now showed clean contrasts of charcoal and silver. Her breathing was slow and deep, the vigilance softened but not erased. Curled against her chest, Ash slept in a tangled sprawl of paws and warmth, belly full, for the first time since Jack had found him. He was still small, still fragile, but life had begun to insist on him. A truck crunched up the drive late in the morning. This time it wasn't an emergency. A woman stepped out, tall and lean, her movements purposeful but unhurried. Laura Mitchell was in her mid-30s, a wildlife rehabilitation coordinator from Helena called in when floods displaced animals beyond the scope of county shelters. She wore faded jeans, a flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves, and her blonde hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, already escaping itself. Sun and wind had browned her skin, and her eyes clear green, steady carried the calm of someone who had learned patience from creatures that did not speak. Laura had lost her younger sister years earlier in a hiking accident, and since then she had dedicated herself to work that turned grief into guardianship. Laura knelt when she saw the dog, not too close, not too far. She observed before she spoke, reading posture and breath the way some people read faces. "She's not feral," Laura said quietly. "She's independent. There's a difference." Jack felt relief he hadn't known he was holding. Laura explained options without pressure. Relocation to protected land, monitored release, long-term placement if the dog chose it. She made it clear that choice mattered not just Jack's, but the dog's. When Laura extended her hand slightly palm down, the shepherd lifted her head, studied the woman, then rested her chin again. Acceptance, not affection. Laura smiled. Later that afternoon, Deputy Mark Holloway returned with supplies and news. The county had lifted evacuation orders. Thomas Green was recovering at his daughter's house upriver. No further rescues were needed. Holloway lingered, looking at Jack with something like respect, stripped of ceremony. "You did more than you had to," he said. Jack shook his head. "I did what showed up." Holloway understood that language too. As the day wore on, Jack cleaned the cabin, patching boards, clearing debris. Laura helped without asking, and when Ash toddled toward her boot, she froze until the mother allowed it. When the puppy finally tumbled into Laura's lap, the shepherd watched closely, then closed her eyes again. Trust earned inch by inch. By evening, the decision was clear without being spoken. Laura could offer support check-in supplies, but the dog had chosen the ground. She stood at the doorway at sunset, ears forward, watching Jack move between porch and yard as if tracking a pattern she intended to keep. Jack felt something settle into place, heavy and warm. Not ownership, belonging. He did not name her out loud. Names were promises. But when he knelt to refill the water bowl, she approached and pressed her shoulder briefly against his leg, the weight deliberate. Jack closed his eyes just for a second and let it happen. That night the stars returned. Jack sat on the steps with the dog beside him and Ash asleep against her belly. The river murmured at a distance, chastened. Jack thought of the years he had spent avoiding attachment, believing solitude was safety. He understood now that isolation had only kept him unfinished. Survival, he realized, wasn't about standing alone. It was about standing long enough for something to lean on you. Inside the cabin, a future took quiet shape. Not dramatic, not loud, just present. Jack finished his coffee and reached for the leash Laura had left on the table, not to use it yet, but to acknowledge possibility. The dog glanced at him, eyes reflecting starlight, and did not move away. The storm had passed. What remained was not ruin, but a beginning strong enough to hold. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder or parted waters. Sometimes they come as a choice made in the cold, a hand reaching out when it would be easier to turn away, or a loyal heart, human or animal, that refuses to let go. God does not always stop the storm, but he places strength inside ordinary souls so they can stand while it passes. In this story, the miracle was not just survival but connection, a broken man learning to stay a mother dog, choosing trust, a life spared because someone answered when fear said no. In our daily lives, miracles often look just as quiet. They are found in checking on a neighbor, forgiving yourself for an old failure, choosing responsibility over escape, or simply getting up one more time when the weight feels too heavy. Faith is not the absence of hardship, it is the courage to move through it with love intact. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment below about where you're watching from or what part of the story stayed with you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story, because you never know when one small moment might change a life. May God bless you, protect your family, guide your steps, and keep you safe through every storm you face.